Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon session of the Rumi Forum on cross-cultural understanding as a path to peace. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'm the founder and president of the Institute on Religion and Public Policy, and I will be your moderator for today's session. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Crane.
Thank you.
Dr. Crane has a very long and distinguished history that would take up the entire session if I read his bio. But of particular interest to us today is the great and immense work that Dr. Crane has done on cross-cultural understanding, particularly among religious communities that he's built over the last several years in Paris. Dr. Crane will tell us a little bit more about that, but his work has been involved very heavily in the education of imams in France on cross-cultural communications and cross-cultural understanding. And actually, a fact that I only learned this morning, that Dr. Crane actually has a letter of reference from Mother Teresa.
Yes.
Now, that is something that I would love to be able to pull out when it comes time for me to stand before my Maker.
I'll lend you a photocopy.
I would appreciate that. I would appreciate. I'm not sure whiteout works at St. Peter, but it is a great pleasure to have you with us this morning, Robert. And why don't you first tell us a little bit about what it is that you've been doing exactly? In other words, what is cross-cultural understanding? So we first get an understanding of what exactly that is.
All right. Well, in the beginning, of course, I had no idea what cross-cultural understanding was, and I found myself in situations where I needed to draw on it. I was a university professor, and a part of my job was to go abroad and to set up joint programs, joint projects. I helped start the first business school in the Soviet Union, for example. And when I was this was in Estonia, I saw that an American approach, a Western European approach simply wouldn't work in the country. The values were too different, the way of thinking was too different. And so I spent some time there and I got to know the way of thinking a bit. And I adapted both the curriculum, a part of my job was to draw up the curriculum, and also the training of the faculty so that a cultural aspect was included. So there was a professional start to all of this. And at about the same time, I found myself traveling a lot. I worked in about 60 different countries. And in a 15-month period, I worked in 21 of those 60 different countries. And over again, I found that the dialogue would stop if I didn't have some understanding of the cultural background of the people I was talking to. A small example, I found myself living with an Aboriginal tribe in the jungle in Malaysia. And I couldn't really make anything out of what the people was all about, what their beliefs were, which was the bit that I really wanted to know about. And I was accompanied by a translator who was Muslim, in fact. And I was the third white person that this tribe had ever seen. There had been a couple of Germans 10 years earlier. And I asked the chief, through the translator, well, what are your religious beliefs? And the chief said, nothing. I said, well, maybe something like spirits, trees, something like that. And he said, no, nothing, absolutely nothing. And then that night, around the campfire with my guide, who was also my translator, we were chatting. And he said, you know, I feel that my mission in life is to convert this tribe to Islam. And I thought, the chief doesn't want to say anything about his religion. And I think it was because he was loath to do so in front of someone who he knew wanted to convert his tribe to another religion. So that was the bit of background that I was missing in order to be able to really communicate. Later on, when I thought about all of these experiences, I thought, well, why not write books about this? So with a group of colleagues, I started publishing on cross-cultural management. Management was my field. And we brought out books on, first, Western and Eastern Europe, a dozen countries, with the history of the country from a cultural viewpoint, not the major historical events, but the events that crystallize a way of thinking in the country. And then secondly, how do you describe that way of thinking? And then finally, what's the impact on management and on the way of doing business in that country? And this led to a series of books. So that's how things got started, management education and traveling to all these different countries.
What brought you from the management side to the interfaith side? What was what was that key that
you're
that
thinking
made
Mother
the cross?
Teresa? No, wrong. I've always been interested in faith. Faith, to my mind, is the central component of life. And I've had the great advantage of meeting Mother Teresa and a private audience with John Paul II in the Vatican. And I'm not Catholic, so there have been these experiences. And then in France, I was approached by the Catholic University of Paris, and the Catholic University had been approached by the French government. Nicolas Sarkozy, our current president, before was Minister of the Interior, and while he was minister, he had the idea, why not try to have a program for the imams of our country so that they can know more what the fundamental French way of thinking is, that is cross-cultural, and the legal environment for a religious organization, and finally what's called laïcité, which is a specifically French form of secularism, and it goes very, very far, this laïcité. So that program was launched. The Catholic University took it on. The Ministry of the Interior first went to La Sorbonne, the most famous French university, and La Sorbonne said, no, we're not going to deal with that, no, not a bit. So then the ministry, it wasn't Sarkozy himself, of course, went to Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis is the part of the Paris suburbs you may have seen burning back in 2005, if you recall. And Saint-Denis, to the great surprise of the ministry, said, nope, hands off, we can't deal with that. So then the Catholic University contacted the Vatican and said, could we do this? They got a green light from the Vatican, and so the Catholic University offered to do the program for a secular state. So you have the church and the state working together. This is almost never seen in France. The Catholic University then contacted me because they had heard of my books, and I also teach cross-cultural management and so on. So I was invited in, and I was asked if I would teach the course. And I said, well, you know, it's a little far from management, but okay, I'll give it a try. And then they said, but are you Catholic? Well, no, actually, I'm Protestant. And the second question was, what kind of Protestant? So I said, well, I'm Anglican. And then they went even further. They said, high church? And I said, yes. So they said, okay, that's all right. So that was how I got involved. Yeah, a surprising welcome, but there you are.
Sure. So tell us a little bit about the programs that you've done. You've done 2 of these now.
That's right.
On the cross-cultural education of imams.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit about what those programs were like and
mm-hmm.
What the measurements were of the success of those programs.
Right. The first thing to say is that the 2 programs were totally different because the audiences, the groups of imams were totally different. A first remark, when I walked in my classroom in January of 2008, faced with 35 imams, I knew nothing about Islam, nothing. I was sort of the tabula rasa, if you like, and so I came in, I thought, what do I do? I think I'll do this like an executive education program. So I turned to the gentleman on my left and said, could you please introduce yourselves and say where you come from? And a half dozen of them stood up spontaneously and pointed to the other side of the room and said, why are those women in this room? Women can't be imams. I didn't know. So I turned to the ladies and I said, well, ladies, could you answer that question? And the ladies stood up and said, under the Shia tradition, going back to the first generation after Muhammad, there's always been a feminine representation among the imams, thanks to a very wise woman, and so on and so on. So the Sunnis, because they were Sunnis, learned something about the Shias, and I learned something about everything. Mm-hmm. And as we went along, because we did introduce ourselves one at a time, I discovered there are 35 different tendencies within Islam represented in the room, and that they didn't know each other among themselves. So I felt, oof, I'm not the only one. And they came from 6 different countries. They had 6 different ways of thinking, national ways of thinking. And our goal that year was to get those ways of thinking out on the table, which means opening up as an individual to talk about what your fundamental values really are. And when I first asked this question, it was a lady imam, in fact, who said, my fundamental values, I am Mohammed, I have no values except those of Mohammed, and I live only for Mohammed. And I said, okay, but couldn't we go a little further? And little by little, I tried to draw them out. And when they understood what I was talking about, they did open up, and there was a real exchange. And we found that there were very different points of view. But when it was a question of religion, a question of Islam, the fundamental values were really almost the same. There was a distinction between the Middle East and North Africa, but otherwise it was virtually the same thing. Yeah.
Who decided where? Who determined where the which imams would be involved? How did the participation get determined?
It was unthinkable for the French government to invite imams first. It was unthinkable for the Catholic University to invite imams second. So the program director had the wisdom to go to the different Muslim organizations in France, and they became partners in this. The principal partner being the Great Mosque, which is not very far from the Catholic University, actually. There's also a political organization for imams founded by the French government, and we called on them as well. And then finally, there's a Turkish representation, and they sent us the first year 4 imams, the second year, I believe, 2. So our first year, the goal was talk about your national feelings, talk about your religious values coming from where you come from. How do you see the French? How do you see the French fundamental values? Third, how do the French see their own values? Because there was a previous study that had been done. And then finally, where are the bridges? Where are the obstacles? What can we do to surmount those? And it came out very well, even though there were linguistic problems. The Turks in particular had been in France for 1 week, so their level of French was tough. But 2 out of the 4 made it through the program. The others came from different countries, and their level of French varied, but in general it was passable at best. And there were 2 native French speakers. The following year, we had 25 participants, that is 2009, and there was a sea change in the audience. This time, over 50% of them were French citizens. French was easily the majority language among them. And the issue then became not how do you compare your values to French values, because their values were French values. The question became, because of an incident actually in the classroom, became Islam and Judaism in particular. What are the fundamental values and where do they match up, where do they not? And because the imams asked me to present on Christianity, which I hardly dared to as a Protestant, so I called in a Catholic colleague, and the 2 of us presented. They wanted to know also what the fundamental values of Christianity were. And the incident, which appeared in the press, was anti-Semitic language by one of the imams to the professor of Judaism, because we have courses on the different religions of France. And he was eliminated from the program, not by us, but by the Muslim authorities.
So the Muslim authorities themselves intervened when anti-Semitic statements were being made? Yes,
they wouldn't accept it. And that led to the course on Judaism. There had already been a course on theology, right? That was the bit that my colleague taught. But my part was to have been, and was, the fundamental values of Judaism, and you're wondering, how in the world can he teach Judaism? I went to 2 Jewish colleagues, one in Paris and the other in California, and asked them to go to their local communities and sound them out about the fundamental values, put together their stories. They did. They came up with a list of values and case studies, and that was what I presented in the classroom. First, I asked the imams, how do you see Judaism? I put all of the points on the board. Second, this is the way the colleagues see Judaism through their communities, and the 2 matched up almost perfectly. The only point where there was real discussion was a point where there's real discussion within Judaism. What is the land of Israel for the Jewish people? And we found that there were at least 2 different tendencies. One, that it was a philosophical notion, and the other, that it was the actual land of Israel. So that was for Judaism. And then for the Christian side, we used primarily the Sermon on the Mount. I asked the imams again to give the list of all of the aspects, the values of Christianity that they saw, and their list was the Catholic Church. So I turned to my colleague and I said, this is not me. You take the class, and she did.
How have you found the success of the program so far? What are there measurables that were incorporated into the programs as you developed it, and if so, what were they? And if not, how have you been able to measure the success of that sense?
Well, that's a tough question in France. In the US, measuring behavior is a fairly widely accepted notion. In France, it's not. How shall I say that? It's a fairly closed society, I think that's fair to say, and trying to measure the behavior of the imams in their different mosques would have been completely unacceptable. What has happened is that the French government has evaluated the program and all of the different programs in France on the whole, and they feel that ours is one of the only 2 programs that are actually functioning. The other one is the chaplains, the military chaplains of France. We now have Muslim chaplains in all of the military services. So
and that's a relatively new addition.
Yes, yes it is. Yes it is. It started, as I recall, with the Army and has spread to the other services. But it is new. It's been within the last, 10 years, I guess? So it is relatively recent. Otherwise, it's by talking to our partners, the Great Mosque, the Turkish delegation, and so forth. How do you perceive what's going on? And what we've heard is positive. We've had no negative feedback. The only negative point that could be pointed out was the anti-Semitic language, and you know that story.
What's the next step for this type of program?
The next step, good question. The next step officially, because this comes again from the French government, is that they want us, the professors, to go into the provinces. There's a list of, I think it's 10 different provincial cities, because these same issues, of course, occur, as I mentioned, in Marseille and Lyon and so forth. And they want us to reproduce what we've done in Paris in the provinces, which means taking a lot of trains. In the longer run, that will mean training of trainers and to have other people replace us. What I hope the step after that might be would be a wider, perhaps European cooperation, which for the moment doesn't exist at all.
But the plan is to actually develop what you've done in Paris to become a national program.
That's
so that these types of discussions are happening across the country.
Exactly.
What do you think is the likelihood of such a development like that, and will that go beyond just the Islamic community in France, but will that also apply to other religious communities?
Well, as you very well know, the key to all of this is money, and the French government has already provided financing, so this will happen, and we will be going into the provinces. Okay. About reaching other religions, again, remember, France is a very rigid society, and communication even from Christians, primarily Catholics. Protestants are maybe 1% of the French population, so it's virtually nil. So the Catholics, the Jews, and the Muslims, there have been formal meetings, yes. Has there been a grassroots contact? No. So I had the idea last year, why not try to use our cross-cultural tools to reach all 3 religions? So I went to the Collège des Bernardins, which is, if you come to Paris, it's a building you've got to see. It's a beautiful 13th century building across the river from Notre Dame Cathedral, and it's state-of-the-art. Their own television facilities and so forth. So it's absolutely magnificent. And their role is, first, outreach to non-believers, and second, outreach to the other peoples of the book, so Jews and Muslims. So I wrote them and said, would you be open to the idea of a cross-cultural workshop among priests, pastors, imams, rabbis, and lay people involved in their different communities? And they came back enthusiastically and said yes. So we did it in July, the 7th and 8th of July, a day-and-a-half program. The first morning was what are cross-cultural aspects of every human being? What are our fundamental values as human beings, as individuals, which then mixed all of the religions, which was a lesson in itself. Second half day, by groups, that is Christians, Jews, and Muslims, what are the fundamental values of our 3 religions? And we drew up lists. We had 3, what should I call us, monitors, I'm not quite sure. One Christian, that was me, a Jew, and a Muslim, leading the other 2 groups. We came up with lists of values, and then the third half day, we compared the lists, where are the bridges and where are the obstacles. So it came off extremely well. And the Collège des Bernardins would like to repeat the operation perhaps 3 or 4 times a year.
That's great. And all within Paris, or is there?
Well, a little bit outside. As I mentioned when we were next door, 1 Frenchman out of 7 lives in Paris. The city dominates the country. So most of our participants were from Paris. The furthest afield were from Normandy and from Lyon, so not that far away. And let me emphasize that the people we had were people at the grassroots level. This was the neighborhood priest, the neighborhood imam, and that was our goal.
So a bottom-up approach to interfaith dialogue.
Absolutely, absolutely. We found that in people's perceptions, which after all is important, the top-down approach has not worked, particularly now. So we're going the other way.
And have you found that since that, it's been a very short period of time since that, since that event?
A month and a half.
A month and a half or so. Has there been any feedback? Have you seen any development? Has there been any opening of communication between the participants, among the participants?
Well, yes, we circulated a list of emails and cell phone numbers, and there have been some emails flowing back and forth. But remember, everybody's on vacation in France, so you know.
Europe comes to a screeching halt in the month of August.
Indeed, right.
So these are some tremendous initiatives that you've undertaken.
Thank you.
What's the next step? You talk about some of the programs that are going on, but I know that you've been thinking about some much more global initiatives.
Oh, you know it very well because you invited me here. So
this is your show, Robert.
Okay,
your
right.
Show.
There are basically 2 things. The first is to try to extend what we did in Paris to other countries, particularly to a Muslim country if possible. We've been talking about Turkey, which would be wonderful. In this country, the John Paul II Center here in Washington, through its director Hugh Dempsey, has said that they'd be very interested in hosting such a meeting. I was contacted in Paris by the Archdiocese of Chicago, so we'll see. The Pontifical University of Mexico City has also said they'd be interested. So there seems to be sort of a network that's being created. And then, as you know, we're submitting for funding, possible funding, from a large foundation in the Middle West right now to try to fund the 2 American venues with the added component of freedom of religious expression, since there's a very clear link between trying to contain or eliminate violence, which was a part of our goal in Paris, to the expression of religious freedom. So that's the first initiative, continuing to expand the idea of the workshops. The second initiative came out of frustration on my part. I knew more or less what was happening with the general French public's relationships with Islam. I saw how it was developing. I saw most of the programs. But I knew nothing about what was happening in Britain or what was happening in Germany or in Spain. And all 3 of these countries, plus others, have large Muslim populations. I went to Oxford to their Islamic Studies Center and learned a little bit about what's happening in that country. But there was no flow of information. So I went to the European Union. There was a meeting on interreligious understanding. And so among the delegates from all the EU countries, I raised the question, what about creating a clearinghouse for information? What's being done? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What are the populations we're dealing with? And nobody was interested. Nobody. So since I had met you when I came to Washington last October, and you dropped by to visit us in Paris in March, you said, what can I do for you? And I said, I want to create an observatory on Islam in Europe. And you said, yes, but in the world. And so that's the next initiative. An observatory, the question is, what is an observatory? What it means is a window, someone who's neutral, someone whose information can be trusted by both sides. So information would come both from Islamic sources and from Western sources, which also implies that the funding should come from both Islamic and Western sources, both private and public. And that's, I think, the only way you can maintain neutrality. So that's the next goal.
Great. And what's your timeline as far as the
timeline,
the establishment and the organization?
Well, we got started thanks to your invitation during this month, and a large number of contacts have been made. We see a number of people who are interested. That needs to be followed up on, and inshallah, if everything works well, we could start in January of next year, 2010.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And as an information clearinghouse, what is it that, what kind of initiatives would the observatory be undertaking? What would the actual work be of the observatory? Is it simply is it a research institution? Is it an information clearinghouse? Is it?
It's primarily a clearinghouse. The background to that would be research, because you need also a longer term view. But immediately, again, speaking of frustrations, the frustration that I hear among many of my Muslim friends in France is, why are we perceived as a violent religion? Why can't people see that 99% of what goes on in our world is very peaceful? And that needs to be brought to a Western audience through a neutral window. Or, to come back to my original frustration, what's going on in the other countries where Islam is a political issue, where Islam is not the dominant religion? What's being done to bring everybody together? And that would be the second sort of issue that would be addressed.
That's great. Well, Robert, with your permission, I'd like to turn the floor over to our audience if we have any questions. Yes, and if you'll stand up and identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Ann Rutherford, and I have no affiliation, just trying to figure things out for myself. I started my goal here is trying to figure out why the terrorists are trying to kill us, and I have done some reading of the Quran, and I applaud your efforts at bringing people who have the same goals together to live in peace. Some things that I'm trying to reconcile, the things that were the obstacles. Some things are very controversial that are written in the Quran, calling the Jews apes and Christians monkeys, and the sword clause that, you know, what defines an apostate, and that you should kill an apostate, and it's a Muslim's job to kill an apostate. So I was wondering how all those negative things come through in your classes, especially speaking with the imams.
You're asking an Anglican to answer those questions. How long has it been since the Catholic Church and other churches forgave the Jewish people for killing Christ? Do you remember that? It hasn't been all that long. Sorry?
It's not written in the book.
Okay. Well,
one of the ways that we can look at this is that there are inconsistencies within the scriptures. That there are certain parts where we're told if your right hand does not know what your left hand's doing, lop it off. Well, I don't see a lot of lopping off happening. It's not always based on the strict the strict language within the scriptures, whether it be from whatever community. It depends on how people interpret and then carry that out.
That sounds right. Sorry?
You know what abrogation is?
Abrogating what?
The Quran, so that whatever said last is the most important, and that's what you should follow.
All right. I'm not a theologian. My field is cross-cultural, and if you're looking for inflammatory language in the Quran, you'll find it. If you're looking for inflammatory language in the Bible, you'll find it. My goal is, as you pointed out, to do the opposite. What really, to my mind, and it's just me speaking, what really counts is the people and their attitudes. And if those attitudes can be affected, maybe in large numbers and maybe over a long time, then we have a chance to live together peacefully. And what I hear from the imams, who after all are the professionals of their religion, is a language that's eminently peaceful. An example, if I may, that touches me as a French citizen, because I'm a French citizen as well as an American citizen. In my classroom, there was one Kabyle, which is a part of Algeria and Morocco, and a different people from the Arab people. And the imam who was speaking said, when I was a boy, the French army came to my town during the Algerian War, and the French army beheaded everybody on our main street. And, whoa! The reaction was, the room exploded. The room exploded. And they all went into Arabic, and I was lost. And they came back about 15 minutes later, and they gave me a summary of what had been said in French. I was very glad that day not to be of French origin, as you can imagine. But the conclusion was, as we talked, that peaceful relations have to be established. They now lived in France. they were becoming French for some of them. And so they had to put behind them what is a very violent past on both sides and try to open onto a peaceful new day, I suppose. It's not exactly the same thing, but trying to build on the idea of peace is important. And if I might add one last comment, there's a group that I met last October when we met in New York, which is working on listening to Islamic extremist language with quotes from the Quran. And they have a group of academics in Islamic universities working on counter-arguments from the Quran, so that as the arguments come out on one side, they can find a rebuttal on the other. And there always is a rebuttal, they tell me.
And where can you find that?
What's the name of the organization? I've got it in my notes. If you'll give me your card, I'll email you their coordinates.
Yes.
And assalamu alaikum to you. It's good to see you, Dr. Crane and Mr. Grabowski. And I just want to say one quick thing. If you're not familiar with Mr. Grabowski's organization, the Institute of Religion and Public Policy, I'm not here to push his program, but I've been on their email list for the past couple of years, and the information is just amazing that you all provide.
We'll send a check after the show.
Thank you. I need it. Okay. What I wanted to say is that not just to address your points, but to say that as a Muslim, and I've been a Muslim for more than 30 years, I grew up as a Christian in America, and that it's unfortunate that we keep, as Muslims, hearing about terrorists, when I think about having been born and raised in America and understanding that in America we have more homicides, more drive-by shootings, more of everything than anywhere else in the world. And the terrorist situation that occurred, as had been stated, 9/11 or anything else, is minimal compared to what we do to ourselves in America. And every week we have, people who are killed, bodies that are found, and on and on. I'm not going to really talk a lot about that, but people need to put it in perspective and to really understand that Muslims are not out here to say, why don't we like you? Why don't some of you like yourselves? And look at reality of what's going on in the world. What I did want to ask Dr. Crane is, you came into this in Islam at a sort of Islam 101. Yes. So where are you now? Islam 201 or 301, or intermediate or advanced, and where you want to take that. And also to give people, if people do want a better understanding about Quran and Islam, I'd say besides just reading it, just like reading the Bible, maybe you might want to have some people to come in and to talk with you that are on both sides, perhaps, than to just read the book. A lot of times we've taken classes in college and in high school, wherever, and you still didn't understand it. You read the book, you did the work that the teacher or the professor required, but you still didn't understand what it was and why you even were taking the class.
Great.
So I would just like to offer that as a possibility of change.
Thank you. Dr. Crane?
Islam 101. Thanks to the American Embassy in Paris, I came to the United States with a French colleague and a Tunisian colleague last October, and there were a series of meetings to present to us Islam in the United States to compare with Islam in France. And so I think I have a bit of a feel for Islam in this country, but I very much agree as a teacher with what you just said. Learning from a book is one thing, living it is something entirely different. And another very short story, it was a Muslim in Kazakhstan who saved my life when the Soviet Union was breaking up. I was supposed to face a firing squad, and he got me out from in front of it. And so that's the sort of thing I won't forget.
Yes, sir.
examining the French attitudes toward other religions, I think it would be useful to establish some perspective because the Muslim community migration into France mostly took place after the Second World War from a number of countries. Earlier, could you please comment on earlier episodes, the expulsion of the Protestants, the French Huguenots, to Switzerland, and the persecution and expulsion of them. That's why there are only 1% Protestants in France. Later on, Napoleon Bonaparte abolishing the ghettos and enabling Jews to integrate in society. In 1892, Alfred Dreyfus, French officer, was falsely accused in treason and was supported by Émile Zola, the newspaper editor. And then, of course, the most important event during the Second World War, most French Jews perished in the concentration camps. So I think all these developments must have some impact on French thinking and how they view the current immigration or the interaction with the growing Muslim community, which makes a contribution to French life and now is part of it because of its growing size.
Absolutely. You've just done a summary of French history. Congratulations. Perhaps the fundamental point is that during the Second World War, since you mentioned the Second World War, there was a song sung by school children which was Je suis français et catholique. That says it all. France was a Catholic country, full stop. And from a political point of view, France, particularly in the early 20th century, felt crushed by the church in a number of areas, education being the obvious one. So what grew out of that in 1905, to be very specific, was complete separation of the church and the state. And this laïcité we were talking about before, French secularism, comes out of that. And to discuss religion in a public forum, first of all, is not allowed. If I were to try to talk about religion in my classroom, the students would have every right to tell me you can't do that. You can't wear signs like a cross or a turban or the veil you've heard about in a public place also. And you raise the other issue of a lack of tolerance on the part of the French people over a long time. And that's also true. The Huguenots were expelled. On the other hand, there were some bright sides to that, if I may. Jewish children during the Second World War were taken in by Christian families, and many of those families were Protestant families. So the wheel continues to turn, and those who suffered then helped those who were suffering later. So what can we say out of all of that? First, it's extremely difficult to talk about religion in France. And you may have seen that our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Kouchner, has just established a forum within the ministry on religion. And this raised an outcry all over the country. How can we deal with religion? The idea being religion is superstition and so forth, and science and education are the way to find the light, and there's a total contradiction between the two. This is slowly evolving, and I think Mr. Sarkozy has done a very good job of trying to play one off against the other so that the position of Muslims in particular can advance. One last comment, because this is a vast subject, is that in the early 20th century, official government organizations were set up for both Judaism and Protestantism because the French government wanted to know who was in charge. Protestant churches, by and large, were not and are not particularly structured, so the French government wanted to have people in front of them that they could deal with. They've just done, within the last 5 years, the same thing for Islam. It's a continuing attitude toward religion, you're right, but what's being done by Mr. Sarkozy and his government now, to my mind, is helpful. And I'm thinking about our little program at the Catholic University in particular.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Is that good?
Turn the microphone.
It's not on.
Little green light. My name's Ann McCormick. I work for a local organization, World Learning. I have two quick questions. One is I would like you to talk about the Peace School, because I read about it today and it looked fascinating. So I'd like to know more about it. And second, going back to the interfaith dialogues that you had with some of the grassroots level pastors and imams and rabbis, have you had a sense that they have a plan to take what they learned back to their communities, and from that be able to have a ripple effect and grow the changes and what can be seen and changed and learned from each other back to those communities? You talked a little bit about French intolerance of religion in general, but maybe if it comes from that grassroots, from your rabbi or from your imam, a dialogue can open. Have you had a sense that from that, is it going to continue? Are there going to be more groups like this?
Yes, yes, and yes. Yeah, that was one of the announced goals when we started the workshop in Paris. That is, we're here in order to start talking to each other, to get to know each other, to build a network. And that was the very first step toward building a network. And the further goal was to try to limit or perhaps stop the violence. So that if there's an incident where you see, I don't know, a young Jew and a young Muslim starting to have a fight, hup, you're on the phone to the rabbi, hup, you're on the phone to the imam. That's a part of the goal. Will it continue? Yes, it will, because Le Collège des Bernardins wants it to continue. And here we're only in the church context now. This has nothing to do with the government. So the two programs at the Catholic University and at the Collège des Bernardins are somewhat parallel. Have I covered that question? Yes. Okay. The other question, I'm really astounded. The Peace School. The Peace School was an idea I had a few years ago, about 5 years ago. My thought was fundamentally, we all have prejudices toward others. How can we eliminate those prejudices? And I think if we start at our ages, it's impossible. It's impossible. So I thought, well, when you actually acquire these prejudices? And I didn't know, so I asked the experts in the field, and the answer was somewhere around the age of 6 or 7 years old. So if we started a school that dealt with different cultures, different religions, and the students, the children, started at age 4, for example, wouldn't that avoid this whole issue? And everybody said, yeah, actually, that sounds like it would work. So I put in 2 years full-time developing the Peace School on paper. So there's a full curriculum age 4 to age 18 academically. And there's about half, or maybe a third, of the curriculum for teaching peace. To do that bit, I got together a committee of Anglicans, that's me, Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, parents, and we worked on what is it that our children could understand, what are the tools that we have now that can help us show other children, so the children would teach each other what our religion is like. Unfortunately, I never got financing for that, so it's still on paper. There's still a website, and it could work, but it would take financing.
Yes, ma'am.
And
Please stand up.
Okay. Hi. You probably know, or if you don't already, good Father Leo can probably tell you about the Year of the Priest and the Curé of Ars, and it's a big year of understanding the role of the clergy in the Catholic Church right now. And the Curé of Ars is a French priest who's been sort of held as an icon. And so I would think there'd be a natural tie-in that you could get a lot of funding, I would imagine, from Catholic groups in France in particular at this particular time. But the other thing was, have you thought about the natural tie-in in terms of mediation and conflict resolution? I know there's a big mediation conflict resolution ADR type school in Nice, Sophie Antipa, whatever, right? That could be a time with your Peace School. But also the international advocates from the Christian Legal Society, those types also strike me as somebody you should connect with. So have you heard of that at all?
No, no.
Okay, because I can do that. I can help you.
That would be great. For the mediation and negotiation, I have a colleague, Alain Nompreux, who teaches at l'ESSEC in Paris and at Harvard, and he's done work particularly in countries that have gone through civil wars, Rwanda being the obvious one, talking to everyday folks, policemen, low-level political officials, and so forth, to try to get the different ethnic groups talking to each other again. And it's true that exists, and it's excellent work, and what he does is wonderful, but there's not the religious side to it. He's kept away from that. So that bit I am familiar with, but I'd love to have some other addresses.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Afifa Saeed, I'm Senior Advisor for Culture and Development at the United States Agency for International Development. Talk about working with governments and bureaucracies. This is a new position, and we're very interested in religious affairs and how we're dealing with it as government employees and agencies as well. So it's a very exciting time. I'm very interested in what you're talking about in terms of globalizing the program. Some of the work that I do specifically is engaging with religious leaders in the field. So I've actually been out there and talking to imams, priests and so on, but also talking to ministries in these countries about where is the disconnect. My perspective, of course, is development. How do we get these folks to be looked at and acted with as development practitioners, not just as religious leaders?
Economic development.
Well, all sorts of development, civil society development in communities.
Okay.
So what I'm interested in what you said, which is part of the practice that I try to follow, which is ask them what they know and ask them what they do. So when I went to Afghanistan, for example, going into some of the rural areas, asking the imams and the mullahs, what do you already do? And they're saying, well, and I translated into development speak, which is conflict resolution. They do peacemaking. They do education. So all the things that they already do are things that we're trying to push for them to have done in their communities. So it's a different perspective on how you get development done meaningfully. So the question I guess I had for you was in terms of the work that you've done, can we move forward from just the dialogue itself, and conflict resolution was brought up, can we have these religious leaders be partners in the work that we do globally in their own communities, because they're already leaders of influence, they're already doing the job that we need to get done, but many times the response will be, but we don't have the capacity. In fact, one group told me in an outer village in Afghanistan was, we want training in domestic abuse, because we don't know how to deal with what it's coming to us now. We've done it traditionally for generations, but there's a new way to do it. So they're asking for that, and what we're trying to do on our end here is have our folks be more trained in how to engage with them. But then in terms of the work that you do, can we move it further along? And I'm sure you've thought of it in this perspective, but in engaging them on these issues that they already work through in their communities and rely on them more for that.
Okay. If I understood you correctly, there are two questions. The first question is, can there be a global network, not just a local network? I think that was a part of it. And then the second is, can we move beyond cross-cultural skills into the other areas that concern the imams? For the first question, that's a part of the goal. But remember, we're starting from the grassroots level. So what does that imply about language skills to begin with? Yes, many French people speak English, but not necessarily the French people that we're dealing with. And if we're thinking of a global language, it's probably going to be English. My hope is that if we get other workshops started in other countries, that there will be networking among the workshops so that we're able to share around. You remember my frustration in Europe, sharing around information and at a grassroots level without trying to go up to the top and then have it come back down again. So that's the first point. The second point, you flatter me by saying, of course, I've already thought of it. Well, not necessarily. What I've been concentrating on, what I was asked to do, was to teach cross-cultural skills. That is, how to get along with your immediate neighbor. And the goal was that we had violence in France, and we had to tamp down the violence. To go beyond that to the other areas you've mentioned, that could be done. But what I've seen in France is what you saw in Afghanistan. They're doing a pretty good job of it already. I'm not sure what we could bring to them. Perhaps the most recent ways of doing it, mediation with my friend Alain Lempereur, for example, that could be added on. But for us, for the moment, it's not the objective. The objective is to build a network and to stop the violence.
To use the moderator's
Please.
priority for just a moment. One of the programs that we're developing within our institute is taking it beyond interfaith dialogue to interfaith social action and engaging religious communities in a discussion on theology of domestic violence, theology of nuclear nonproliferation, theology of religious freedom, so that religious communities first determine within their own theological framework what their systems of belief are regarding these issues, and then working across theological lines to find one, interfaith engagement with other communities on these issues, but then translating that out of the churches, the mosques, and the synagogues, and the other houses of worship into the streets talking about these issues. Because we have to get beyond, and this is, I think, in some ways what you're trying to do in Paris, Robert, is to get beyond just interfaith dialogue so that it stops being interfaith talking and starts being interfaith doing.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Crane, I listened with great interest. I noticed that perhaps in response to one of the questions, the question of language came up. And you mentioned incendiary language and perhaps peace-oriented language. My background is in language and linguistics. And of course, you've perhaps come across the hypothesis of linguistic relativity, which implies that people who speak different languages live in different worlds. It's not one that I subscribe to, but it is a respectable approach to language differences. I was wondering, there's a school of approach to language and literary questions that is called postmodernism. And living in Paris as you do, perhaps you've had some encounter with this. I had the fortune to meet Jacques Derrida, who is he recently passed away, a great exponent of postmodernism, and a student of language and how it can in fact be deconstructed so that none of us are captive to our own notions, which create a lot of stress. And this is universal. You know, we are ruled by some of our linguistic concepts in a naive way until we come to understand them in the way postmodernists and other thinkers do. And once that is achieved, it's a great lowering of pressure in these strife-generating situations. Thank you. I don't really have a question as such, but perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I'd love to, and I think Joe would like to too.
I'll leave this one to you.
Okay. Charles V, Charles le Quint of Spain, said several centuries ago, a man is worth as many languages as he speaks. And that, in Europe as a whole, is the approach that's being taken at the level of the European Union. That is, young people learn several different languages. In France, 95% of all French school children learn English, either as their first language or as their second language. And there are 2 languages required. As it happens, the French equivalent of Oprah, his name is Bernard Pivot, put me on his television show because he liked my books, but he also wanted to talk about my kids. I have lots of kids. I have 7. And, well, I'm not Catholic. Wait a minute.
It's high church Anglicanism.
There you are. And the reason he put us on his show with one of my daughters, there were 2 of us, was that he felt we might be a model for what the French family might be in the future. All of the kids speak 3 or 4 languages, and English and French to start with, and then Spanish, German, and then Russian, Japanese, and Greek. And all of the kids have a different skill. There's an actor, there's a journalist, there's a stockbroker, there's an archaeologist, and 2 housewives. So that's the group. And his thought was that this is the way our country might move, because you need those language skills, but language alone is not enough. You also have to have a professional skill. And that's sort of a down-to-earth approach to what Mr. Derrida was looking at earlier. Certainly you are, to a degree, defined by the language that you speak. It defines somehow your thought processes and what you can see and not see. And this, when I first came to France, was a major obstacle. People were still thinking in a certain way, and a part of that came from the language they spoke. The number of languages has increased. Younger people are reaching out to other countries, and I think there's something of a mix that makes France more congenial to international contacts. We still have the barriers I talked about, but those barriers are little by little coming down.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Dr. Crane.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.